Thank you, everybody. And we continue with our programming. I'm Jonas Plesner, the Executive Director here in the Alliance of Democracies. It's great to see so many familiar faces out there, to see so many democracy activists, political leaders that are here for this debate. And we will continue. I mean, we've just been talking about the war in Ukraine and what we can do to help Ukraine. More in that. And what we're going to talk about now is Taiwan, is about sort of the war that might happen and how to avoid that. So with that, I have Matt Pottinger with me here. So give him a hand. Thank you. Our session is called What a Democracy Should Do to Defend Taiwan. Matt was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration until January 6th. 2021. You were also really instrumental in developing a new China strategy for the US administration. And I would say, even though you left at that time, in the Washington Post, Josh Rogan wrote, Matthew Pottinger exits, but his China strategy is here to stay. And I would say that's fair to say that the Biden administration, to a large degree, has continued some of the sort of fundamentals of a China strategy that were set while you were in office. You're also very engaged in how the free world defends Taiwan. That's a topic that's high on both of our minds. You have this book coming out here. It's called The Boiling Mode, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. So we have a bit of book club up here as well. In it, military and political leaders map out a workable strategy for Taiwan, the United States, and their allies to deter China from pursuing acts of aggression against Taiwan. This is a really important conversation, so I also want all of you to join in. You've been in the room for a long time, listened to a lot of people, so it's important that we also get all of you engaged. So I do have the iPad up here, so just ask a question and we'll try to fit that into the conversation. And Matt, I'll start you off with, I think, very easy question. How do we secure peace in the Taiwan Strait?
Yeah, right. Well, the big lesson of the past few years is that deterrence would have been a lot cheaper than war. It would have been a lot cheaper in Ukraine if we had deterred Vladimir Putin. It would have been a lot cheaper in the Middle East if Iran had not armed Hamas and other terrorist proxies to wage war against Israel and in the Red Sea. And it would be vastly cheaper for us to collectively deter Beijing from pursuing war to annex Taiwan. The other lesson on the past few years is that democracies have gotten worse at deterrence. So this is a moment of self-reflection, but a rather urgent job of self-reflection that we have to undertake. Why is it that we have failed repeatedly in several instances, whether it was the Taliban overrunning an elected government in Afghanistan, or what's happened in Europe with the largest war since World War II in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And I fear in other parts, I saw Leo Lopez walking around. I want to get his advice about the dictator Maduro and his plans. He's now threatening his neighbor, Guyana. And he's orchestrating, of course, a sham election this July for himself. We have China putting pressure in the South China Sea on the Philippines and other countries. And then there's, of course, Taiwan. So what do we need to do? Number one, without hard power, all of the other instruments of national power and collective power while those things are necessary, diplomacy and economic policy, information policy, those things won't amount to much if we don't have credible hard power in the form of a very formidable Taiwan defense, a very formidable Japanese defense, and statements of intention to participate in Taiwan's defense if China attacks. And there's a role for Europe as well. And Jonas, we've both written books recently. This is Jonas's book, by the way, which I was just reading, which is terrific. And Jonas and Anders Fogh Rasmussen contributed a chapter to my new book as well. So both of these books are.
What I said. Yeah. It's book club that you're now
book
joining.
Club.
It's afternoon book club here.
It's great.
It's all recommended reading, at least Matt's book. Go ahead.
That's right. Well, look. So how do we develop a formidable hard power which is really what Xi Jinping is looking at. He's looking at our intentions as democracies, whether we have the will to fight, and he's looking at our capabilities, whether we have the capabilities to fight. One of the things we've learned over the past 2 years is that we've allowed NATO collectively, the broader free world has allowed its defense industrial base to atrophy, particularly in the production of munitions. So it's one thing to have all these exquisite warships and bombers and stealth fighter planes. It's another thing to have enough ammunition to actually make those weapon systems formidable. And people like Xi Jinping, he's a Leninist. He believes that he's already at war, that there's no such thing as true peace. It's all just a spectrum of what degree of conflict Xi Jinping believes China is in at the moment. But he studies the idea of being able to fight a fast war, but also having to stay in for a longer war. So we have to demonstrate to him that we have the capability to stay in a long war if necessary, just like we need to stay in it for the long haul on behalf of Ukraine. If he doesn't believe that we have the capability to produce enough munitions, he's going to believe that he and his authoritarian proxies like Vladimir Putin and the Ayatollah and others will have the ability to outlast us in a fight. And that will tempt them to go into the fight in the first place. So that's the paradox we have to grow comfortable with. The more willing we are to fight, the more capable we are of fighting, the less likely it is that we will have to fight another war.
And if you map out the sort of the deterrence, because just, as you say in the book, and yes, we have contributed to it, sort of, it needs the US, it needs allies, I mean, Japan, of course, and Taiwan itself, of course. There are also some lessons there to learn from Ukraine and the way they've been able to defend themselves.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can break that down a little bit more for us on like the deterrence, on what do you see, what are the urgent steps basically that the different parties need to take today and tomorrow?
First, we have to recognize that Taiwan has a big advantage in the form of geography, right? What would the Ukrainians have given to have 100 miles of ocean between them and Russia, right? Taiwan has an enormous advantage in the fact that Taiwan looks like a fortress from the outside. It's got a mountainous coast along the east. It has long, slow, difficult to cross mud flats along the side of the strait that faces mainland China. And so Taiwan doesn't have to be as robust as Ukraine. It simply has to be able to show that it can prevent an amphibious assault from succeeding. And amphibious warfare is really the PhD level of warfare. It is very, very difficult to pull off an amphibious assault, even under the best of conditions. And crossing 100 miles of the Taiwan Strait to go to a place where there aren't that many landing beaches or ports that would be easy to access is an advantage to Taiwan. So that's number one. Taiwan, I think, needs to start working on its own military-civilian culture. And it should be looking to countries like the Baltic states. It should be looking to Finland. It should be looking to Israel to have a much more robust reserve force that's capable of quickly mobilizing and fighting effectively. That will do a lot to give Chinese war planners food for thought about whether it would be a good idea to attempt a war in the first place. Japan actually is building a much more robust military capability, but is very timid about expressing its intentions in the event of a crisis. Japan needs to talk more openly the way that Japanese officials talk in private when I meet with them when I visit Tokyo. I think there's a growing recognition that Japan would have to be involved in a major way in a war over Taiwan. They need to talk about that openly now, prepare their public, recognize that the Japanese public is more pragmatic than sometimes I think leaders give them credit for. And the more that Japan is expressing its intention to help defend Taiwan, the less likely a war is to break out in the first place.
maybe one thing to add as a sort of basic on Taiwan, China, is also now that we heard at the Democracies Summit, is that in many pollings of international democracy, you actually have Taiwan up among sort of the 10 best democracies kind of in the world. It's actually also one of the few democracies that sort of progressed up the rankings during COVID. And meanwhile, we have China going completely sort of the other direction. I mean, that's also, I think, a big part of what's at stake also for us here in the room. So when we talk about deterring a war, it's also the possibility that 23 million people that now live in a free society would be sort of forced to be under a one-party rule as it is in the rest of China. And as, of course, the Taiwanese and the rest of us have seen happen to our Hong Kong friends, which we also have here in the audience today. Yeah. So I think that's maybe something to sort of a base point kind of all of us. I've had several questions sort of come in, and do actually add your names and everything, then I give you a shout out as well, but some of these here I don't have a name on. The US doesn't recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. Couldn't recognition be a good catalyst for more support to Taiwan from the Western world? I think that's actually really interesting and kind of hard question as well. What would benefit on that front the Taiwanese?
Yeah. Look, I mean, Taiwan, for all intents and purposes, looks like an independent state in that it is a democracy. The Taiwanese people vote for their own leaders. They have their own military. They have their foreign ministry that has relations still with a number of countries. I think that if Beijing were to initiate aggression against Taiwan, we should very much consider collectively mass recognition of Taiwan as an independent state, because by initiating war against Taiwan, China, Beijing is itself admitting that Taiwan is an independent state by waging war against Taiwan. So I think that we should look at that as part of our deterrent recipe, helping Beijing understand that if they take up arms against what is a very peaceful government and a peaceful country, we will mass recognize Taiwan as an independent state. I don't think it's necessarily wise to do that in advance of a conflict. Beijing is looking for any pretext to blame anyone other than itself for waging war against Taiwan, and I don't think we should add to the sort of pretextual argument that Beijing is confecting. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
Then I have some that I kind of mixed together with my own questions. So several of you out there have asked about Trump. Of course, if he comes back into the White House, there's both a question of what kind of China strategy. There are, of course, also people here in their questions questioning, can Trump sort of be the leader of the democratic world that could lead something as this? And I know you stepped sort of down in conjunction with the riots on January 6th. So I think this is also interesting. I mean, you can both give a narrow, kind of wonky on the strategy, but also, of course, more broader on how do you see the U.S. evolving, and if we end up with a Trump 2.0 in November.
Look, there's a very good chance that President Trump gets reelected. On China generally, I think you're correct in that Josh Rogan, when he wrote that article that you just cited, was correct that there has been continuity from the Trump years into the Biden administration on China policy largely. President Biden ended up keeping a lot of the key policies in place, tariffs on China at a time when Xi Jinping's whole economic strategy is to export his way to world dominance. China accounts for only 10% of demand globally, but more than a third of global manufacturing. And so he wants to swamp all of our economies with cheap, subsidized exports. And so I think it was a wise decision for President Biden to keep those tariffs in place. President Biden this week is going to expand those tariffs, and President Trump on the campaign trail is talking about expanding them further as well. I think that when it comes to Taiwan, President Biden is distinguished himself from all of his predecessors in that he said publicly four times, he said that if China attacks Taiwan, President Biden will commit U.S. military forces to Taiwan's defense. Most presidents up to that point had been ambiguous about what we would do depending on the circumstances. President Trump is still in that category of presidents who maintain a degree of strategic ambiguity. That said, I do think that President Trump, over the course of his time in office, came to appreciate how important Taiwan is to U.S. National security as well as our prosperity and that of our allies. And so I hope that he does not back away from President Biden's standard that he has set.
But I hear a little hesitation. Do you fear a transactional approach to Taiwan as well, of saying, oh, if the Chinese wanted that badly and I can get some better trade deal on soybeans?
Yeah, I don't think that's the right message. I'm not sure how Beijing will actually interpret that message ultimately. I think they misinterpreted Trump multiple times in ways that backfired for Beijing. They thought that the tariffs that President Trump put into place would be easily repealed by Trump if they put pressure on U.S. farm exports and things like that. That did not work out as planned for Beijing. It's President Trump, if nothing else, is often unpredictable, and I think that might be the case with respect to Taiwan as well.
I have questions here again that I mixed together, but they're on chips. So there's, I think, twofold. One is on, is it Taiwan sort of silicon shield? And two, the fact that it's now moving abroad, in particular to the U.S., will that diminish U.S. interest in Taiwan?
No, look, Taiwan produces something like 93% of all the world's advanced semiconductors. Even with the investments that the United States and Japan...
And that sounds fancy, but this is. It's like, it's all your iPhones, it's all the PlayStations, it's all the electric cars, it's all these things that make our modern electronic world and technological globalization work.
That's right. And there is no scenario over the next decade where U.S. investments and German investments and Japanese investments and South Korean investments recreate all of that capacity outside of Taiwan. Taiwan is going to remain absolutely essential to the 21st century economy for well into this century at least. So I don't think that there's a scenario there where we feel as though we are independent of our dependency on Taiwan for high-tech inputs into the world economy. By the way, if you look, the phone you were just showing, this has a couple of high-end, expensive chips that were probably made in Taiwan. And then there's another couple dozen or more legacy chips, meaning older generation chips that make up things like the microphone and the wireless antenna and so forth. Beijing's strategy now is to dominate the manufacture of those so-called legacy chips. And so I think that what the United States is going to be doing is proceeding with a new phase of its strategy of export controls to make it harder for China to dominate the world supply of those legacy chips. That could become a major choke point for the economy if Xi Jinping succeeds in his ambition there.
Thanks, Matt. I have one question here where I really use my sort of moderator prerogative. It's from Anita Chang, who also helped me on my book out in Taiwan. So I think when she'll also put her name in the question, is it a misunderstanding in the Western democracies that helping Taiwan is putting Taiwan in a more vulnerable position? Therefore, the West should back down. If so, how can the misunderstanding be resolved?
Yeah, it's great. Look, we have a strange pathology in the West that we think that standing up for defense of democracies is somehow provocative and can somehow provoke wars. This is a basic, deep historical misunderstanding of how wars actually start. And Beijing and Vladimir Putin and other savvy dictators play to this psychological weakness of ours. We think that by simply strengthening our defense against a much stronger aggressor, that somehow we might be provoking their action. History tells us that the opposite is true. Weakness is provocative. And wars, by the way, don't start by accident. This is one of the other great misconceptions that is carried over, from the 20th century. Even if you go back to World War I and you examine the causes of World War I, it's very clear that there was a very deliberate set of steps that were taken. The consequences of war are highly accidental, but the decision to wage war, if a war is going to occur, it's going to be because Xi Jinping wants a war. And so what Taiwan has to do is create, together with the United States, Europe, Japan, and others, is a boiling moat to show Beijing that to cross that moat of 100 miles of water of the Taiwan Strait, they're going to lose their navy. And we should make that boiling moat strategy really the urgent priority now.
Thank you, Matt. That's all we have time here on stage. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be with you. And we stay on Taiwan, so it's now my pleasure to introduce our founder, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who will come in and introduce our next speakers directly from Taiwan. So stay tuned for this really important part. Great to see you all.